Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming along and for kind of being interested in listening to this discussion. My name is Alexa. I'm one of the directors of Transgender NI, a human rights organisation which exists to support and advocate for trans communities in Northern Ireland. I am joined today for this discussion on trans liberation and feminism in Northern Ireland by Rachel Powell, who I will let introduce herself.
Hi, so I'm Rachel Powell. I'm the Women's Sector Lobbyist with the Women's Resource and Development Agency. I know most of you here anyway, and you'll be quite familiar with our work, but we are a regional membership organisation and we support women across all of Northern Ireland. And that really varies from policy and advocacy to training, good relations, health screening awareness. A lot of different programmes go on through our work. So I'll probably today cover a bit of that and how I've worked with Alexa. But yeah, that's me.
One of the kind of main ways that I kind of have gotten involved in feminist movements and in working in kind of feminist policy is through the Women's Policy Group, which is kind of headed up by Rachel as the Women's Sector Lobbyist. So I'm going to let her talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I might start a bit further back in how I got involved in working on trans liberation as well. So Jay will be very familiar with this. Myself and Jay worked a lot together in recent years, starting probably 2017 maybe. We came together and met up with Ellen Murray, who I'm sure all of you will know, and decided that we wanted to run the first ever trans students campaign at Queen's Students' Union. At the time, I was the Equality and Diversity Officer, so I had the funding there and I had a marketing team to support that. So I kind of just did the background stuff and Jay connected the campaign to a really wide group of people. And that's also when I first met Alexa, who was a young student at the time and came up from Newry to MC the Trans Performance Night, which some of you actually performed at. My Alexa is talking now that I've said your name. But from then it's been something, for me, you can't really work in feminism without working on trans issues as well. And that's something I've been passionate about since I was quite young, actually. And it's something my mum has been passionate about from I was a young age, and I always remember her talking about it. So I never really understood people who were working on feminism and didn't see trans liberation as a part of that. So that's where it began a number of years ago for us. And it was really successful in the student movement working on that. And I know a lot of you have been involved. And I was quite lucky to be able to continue working with Alexa afterwards. So I was the human rights officer for a while in the Human Rights Consortium, and we worked together on a whole range of human rights issues and had a really strong overlap. And then we were very lucky to be able to start the relationship again whenever I moved into this role as Women's Sector Lobbyist. So one of my first things was chatting to Alexa outside an Equality Coalition meeting and saying, will you please join the Women's Policy Group? Will you join the Reclaim the Agenda campaign? I just think you need to be on these. We need your voice. And now, luckily, we get to work with each other all the time, really, on all of these different campaigns and coalitions. It's great.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's kind of, a big thing for trans communities generally is that it's often hard to kind of permeate feminist movements and to get involved and, especially to make your voice and experiences heard within those movements sometimes, if they haven't already kind of done the groundwork to be inclusive and to kind of diversify who they're representing and who they're working with, then it can be quite difficult to get in there. But I mean, having someone on the inside to kind of encourage that openness, encourage that inclusivity, and not just Rachel, but so many of the people on this call, including Danielle and so many other folks, especially the WRDA as an organization has been incredibly supportive of kind of getting more trans people involved in feminism and in the feminist movements. And one of the big kind of pushes on that is a kind of joint project between WRDA and a few other women's organizations called Raise Your Voice, which is an anti-sexual harassment campaign that we're also involved in and contribute to. And the kind of efforts that were made to kind of reach out and say, actually, obviously we are targeting this at women who have experienced sexual harassment. However, we understand that trans people of all genders also experience sexual harassment, often on a daily basis. And kind of the kind of work that was done to incorporate those experiences and make sure that they were included is really, really important. And I'm glad that it goes on in Northern Ireland.
That's something I must note as well. Elaine is like the main power horse behind that, who's on this call too. So thanks to Elaine for all the work you've been doing on Raise Your Voice. It's in its first year has already been an incredible movement. And we know with you and others behind it, it's always going to be an inclusive movement as well. So it's something that I'm very proud to see from WRDA, and I think it's fantastic what you have been doing on it. Yeah, I was going to talk a bit more about just some of the areas that we already work together in. And I suppose for myself and Alexa, we're relatively young. Alexa's younger than me, but we're relatively young women. So in the movement as well, I think we kind of looked at each other initially and thought, right, we're quite often the youngest people in the room. And I think we are surrounded by other young people with, you know, new ideas and different perspectives on things. And that was something that was always reassuring to me. Even now, today, we could be on different calls related to, you know, COVID-19 or some sort of policy or hate crime, and myself and Alexa look at each other sometimes. It's like, are you okay? Do we understand what's happening here? And it's quite good, I think, you know, trying to bring more, for us young women in the women's sector, it's hard to sometimes cross that divide between the student movement, which is so active and really engaged, and then connecting that with the women's movement, because quite often the work is going on in parallel, and we've seen that as well in our own work in the student movement, working on women's issues, a whole range of activities. So I suppose that's something that we're working on as well and trying to continue with that overlap.
Absolutely, and getting folks over from student movements and kind of being involved in student politics to actually working on like the kind of the grassroots and different other community movements and kind of activism. It's something that you yourself have done quite well in terms of transitioning over. But it's you know, it's often, it doesn't happen like that. You know, often people go through student politics and then, you know, get involved in maybe elected politics and maybe just kind of forget about the rest of the stuff. I mean, we've seen some you know, councillors and folks from different political parties all across the spectrum who have forgotten about the grassroots and who have forgotten about the communities despite originally starting in student politics. So it's really important to kind of, you know, bridge that divide and make sure that those involved in the kind of student movement are definitely kind of brought into transgender NI, to all of these different movements, the women's sector and feminist movements, so that those voices aren't lost when folks leave university, because there's still so much work to do. One of the kind of the big overlaps between kind of the student activism, the feminist movements and the trans movements is on abortion, on access to abortion, and on bodily autonomy more generally. You know, it's something that I'm personally really passionate about. I was involved in the repeal campaign before I moved away from Dundalk, and you know, kind of half sacrificed my A-level studying time to go out and knock on doors, and because it was just such an important thing to get done and get right. And you know, in the Republic, I'll be completely honest, you know, working to make that campaign and make that work trans inclusive, you were pushing on closed doors, and often it was quite difficult to ensure that trans voices and trans experiences weren't completely abandoned and lost through the referendum campaign because of this want to appeal to Middle Ireland. And I mean, like, you know, I moved kind of primarily from activism in the south to kind of activism up north as well, and you know, work was actively done to make those movements more trans inclusive, to change the language, to move to kind of gender neutral terms for describing, you know, kind of pregnant people and access to abortion more generally. And you know, as a result, more trans people came out and kind of started fighting in that campaign, and got involved and got marching and felt comfortable being in those spaces, which is, you know, a really important thing for trans folks to get involved in feminist movements. There needs to be an understanding of trans experiences within those movements, and a kind of an inclusion of those into the work and into the activism of the feminist groups and organizations. And, you know, I mean, like, I think that has been really well done in Northern Ireland around trans people's access to abortion, especially.
Yeah, this is an area that I only started this role in, well, end of September, early October. You'll all know Kelly Tartley had the role before me, and there's so much work done in the sector already long before I came on trans inclusivity. And day one, when I came into the role, it was very much, you know, in a few weeks' time, the abortion will be decriminalised in Northern Ireland, and we need to campaign on this. And that was something that we were just working on non-stop. Some of you will remember how hectic the last few weeks in October were. We were all celebrating but exhausted at the same time. And we knew then, just because things were decriminalised, we knew that, you know, when governments are pulling together legislation, they're not necessarily always conscious of different Section 75 groups, and we've seen that over and over again. And when you look at the abortion regulations, when they were pulled together, in the Section 75 screening of people from protected characteristics, it said there was no impact on LGBT people, which was just absolutely, like, that's just bollocks. And it also said, you know, things like no impact on those with dependents, no impact on rural women. It said the only groups that had an impact on were women and girls, and wasn't it those with religious beliefs?
Yes, yeah.
Because, you know, some man in a church, you know, it impacts him worse than like a trans man who's being denied access. It's just, it doesn't make any sense. And they had the evidence there and they were choosing to ignore it. So it was just another example of where, you know, bodily autonomy is an overlapping theme for the women's movement and the trans movement. Access to healthcare is an overlapping theme. You know, having evidence ignored all of the time to support people with ideologies rather than what's actually best practice for people is something that we see for women, and we see it in the trans movement all the time. So this was something, you know, we worked together really closely on this, Alexa. We were drafting letters. There's loads of us here on this call who were, but we essentially tortured the Secretary of State. And, you know, sending letters weekly, sending emails to all his staff, putting out, this is an SOS. Why will the Secretary of State not meet with us? Why does he not care about these groups? Why are you meeting with churches and the Orange Order instead of us? And eventually it worked, and he agreed to a roundtable, and then he got sacked. So we had to start over again. And we continued again. You know, we would work with Alliance for Choice and get some of the content that they wanted us to cover. I would add in stuff from WRDA in our responses. Alexa would add in the perspective from Transgender NI. And even though we were adding our own perspectives to it, we were reinforcing the same messages over and over again to the point where they couldn't ignore us anymore. And we kind of made a bit of a show of them on social media, which helped as well. And even when there was a few of us did go to meet with the Minister Walker and NIO staff. Alexa couldn't make it, unfortunately, but Danielle, for an example, you know, an LGBT women's organisation, was on the ball asking, what language are you using here? Why does it say women and girls? Are you going to include this? And Danielle, I hope you don't mind, I'm going to tell a quick story where Minister Walker tried very clearly to get us out of the room because we just full on had to go at him for an hour. And Danielle went, you look like you're trying to leave, but I'm not finished. And continued covering more points and just hammering it home again. But to be able to do that, we had to know, you know, what was the stance from Transgender NI. And it kind of just highlights for us, and something that myself and Alexa talk about quite a bit, is it can be really hard to get in the room with these politicians and with these groups and these decision makers. So for us, it's so important that we overlap and constantly know what each other's working on, so that if I'm in a room and Alexa isn't, I can cover that. And if Alexa's in a room and I'm not, she can cover that. And that's something, especially since Stormont got up and running again and talking with ministers and, you know, submitting evidence to different committees, we've just essentially shared everything. Like, we talk all of the time, but it just, to me, it really complements, our work complements and strengthens through this collaboration, and it is really a shared struggle. And that's just one example of something that has been going on recently. We have a worse example, which was the bane of our lives for the last 6 months for many people here, the hate crime review.
I know many people on this call will have heard both myself and Rachel talking non-stop.
Yeah, Danielle has it. I almost burned mine last week.
Oh no, I'm getting ready to throw mine out.
My last
It's the worst. Mine had the key tunes and everything all over it.
The hate crime review was, now just for context, the hate crime legislation in Northern Ireland is, for lack of a better term, incredibly bad.
It's rubbish.
The model itself is completely, like it often results in just people not getting prosecuted and hate crimes not being dealt with. And the legislation also doesn't cover transphobic hate crime. So any transphobic hate crime that goes through the courts, if an enhanced sentence is applied, then it will be applied on the basis that it was a homophobic hate crime. So there's a million and one issues with the hate crime legislation as it stands, and you could tell that there was a million and one issues because the consultation document was 310 pages long, and so it was myself and Aisling from the Rainbow Project and Rachel and a few others from WRDA. And from different groups around the around the sector. Elaine's just saying in the chat that it's like a 1990s phone book. We all got around the table and basically started going through these pages and being like, what the hell does this mean? And kind of, bouncing things off each other and like making sure that we all came down on the same line, on the same issues, and got a shared way forward. Because whenever you have different groups from different sectors all saying the same thing, it's much harder to ignore. And so we decided that, to include gender, specifically misogyny, to include transgender identity, to include intersex folks, and also sex workers, and kind of, we developed that as a kind of joint position, and developed our joint position on the actual model itself, and went forward with that. And I mean, look, the independent review is still ongoing, so we'll see if those efforts paid off. But I think that we hammered it home pretty well, and it's one of the ways where kind of it demonstrates very clearly that we are stronger together. And this nonsense that you see in Britain, where all of these groups are so divided and constantly attacking each other, it just completely distracts from the issues where they could be working together and they could be making gains and they could be actually fighting for human rights. But unfortunately, it's not happening. And
just on that, I suppose this brings it back to how important it was to have Alexa on the women's policy group from, the last 6-7 months, because this was one of the other things that arrived on my desk as soon as I started, and myself and Elaine went to meet with the judge in October before they had any plans on what the review would be like. We just knew there would be some sort of consultation. Whenever we met with Judge Marinan, we were very clear that misogyny needed to be treated as a hate crime, and that we needed to see gender, and we needed to have an understanding of intersectionality as well, because there's no room for that whatsoever in the existing hate crime law. And just the hate crime law in general, like I don't think I could ever have enough time to explain how awful it is. But we had to get our heads around that, and it was so clear from our first meeting with the judge, even though we got the impression that he was on our side, and I think he wanted us to provide the evidence for him to be able to make recommendations. He also was trying to make us aware of some of the responses other people would be making. So, well, what about domestic violence of women against men, or what about misandry and some of the, I was actually at one point so distracted, I borrowed one of the guy's pens in the justice office, and I was like, I snapped his pen in front of them. I was like, I'm so sorry, in the middle of the meeting. But I just remember leaving and thinking, this is going to take over our lives for the next few months, because this is an unbelievably unique opportunity for us to change the laws in Northern Ireland for the better. And hate crime in Northern Ireland, we have the worst rates of the murder of women joint in Europe. Our domestic violence levels are through the roof. Trans misogyny online in particular is horrific. We had the opportunity to have misogyny, trans misogyny recognised, to have online hate crime included in this review, and this was something that we immediately recognized we all needed to work together on that. And I remember leaving that meeting and saying, Alexa, contact this judge. and I think you met with him like 3 or 4 days later. And we continued that then. So through the Women's Policy Group, where in that group, it's not just women's organizations either. We have, the Equality Commission, the Human Rights Commission, we have human rights organizations, NGOs, individuals, LGBT groups. It's really, really broad, and individuals can sit on it as well. But through that, we were able to start gathering, who's an expert on this, or who knows of other groups that have done something similar. And Jonna from NIWA as well was able to send us information on what happened in Scotland through Engender. They tend to be better as well in their feminist movements than some of those in England. They aren't as fractured. So we had a lot to learn from, and moving forward then, we attended every public event that we could and just consistently questioned the judge. And we were able to then come up with a joint front as well on how we were going to approach the questions on gender and gender identity, excuse me, because in the hate crime consultation that did come out, it then treated gender as one thing, which kind of seemed like it was about cis women. Gender identity, okay, trans people fit in here. We'll also put in around transgender identity again, and then intersex. And for us, we worked really closely with Alexa, and we waited on Transgender NI to come with an official stance on this, which we then brought to the Women's Policy Group. And the stance was gender and gender identity are the same thing. You're othering trans people by thinking that, only cis women fit into gender, because who's going to be making the determination if it's gender or gender identity? Are you going to have, some police officer who doesn't know anything about trans issues, who previously would have thought it was a homophobic hate crime? How are we going to get over this? And we brought this to the rest of the human rights sector as well, who were a bit surprised initially in our response, but we stood our ground. And we included it in all of our responses. So a wide range of organizations put in the same information. We supported gender, specifically misogyny and trans misogyny, and also transgender identity, to ensure that data collection and adequate support was being put in place. So it took a long time, and a lot of people here will know we had Des sitting in the WRDA office when it was roasting, and we all had about 10 cups of coffee each, and I felt like any one of us was going to break into tears or laughter as we got like halfway through the hate crime document. But we finally got there, and it just is an example again of where both of our works were strengthened immensely through working together.
Absolutely.
There was a huge group of us on that, and I think all of us learned a lot as well. Even on gender and misogyny, I learned even more about the complications in law, and I learned so much from Alexa too. So it's just another example, but it's something, that often people don't see us working away on in the background, but has the implications to change law forever in Northern Ireland, which would be amazing.
Absolutely. And, obviously keep an eye out for whatever comes out of that hate crime review. And look, if it's not adequate, we will be pushing for it to be better, and obviously there's the independent review that's led by the judge. And he's going to come up with his own position on it, and he's going to kind of publish that. But then the NI Assembly have to agree to adopt that law and adopt that legislation and vote it in. So our work isn't over. We'll be once this review is done, and if we get all of our points included in there, then it's about lobbying the politicians, and kind of hopefully we'll do that together as well. Because I mean, and this is kind of coming on to the kind of second part of the discussion on why we work so closely together. All of these different issues are linked, and I mean, especially when we're thinking about the oppression of trans people, the oppression of cis women, and trans people of all genders, it all essentially does stem from patriarchal ideals and a patriarchal society, a society that upholds the values of two binary genders with specific roles, specific norms attached, specific stereotypes, and specific things that you have to be if you are assigned one of these at birth. And misogynistic violence, transphobic violence, transmisogynistic violence all stems from this patriarchy and these patriarchal ideals. And I think that's one of the reasons that I feel so passionately about being involved in feminist movements anyway, is because I mean, I see our work as relatively similar in terms of we are fighting patriarchy, we are fighting the kind of gender stereotyping, we are fighting sexual harassment and violence, and you know, all of these different things stem from the same essential source, really, when we're thinking about it.
It's something I think as well that this is rooted in all aspects of our work as well, in WRDA, and sometimes it's not always the things that you would think, you know, really obvious examples, say of myself lobbying or Elaine working on Raise Your Voice. You know, there's other areas such as we have workers who work with groups with additional support needs on providing information on breast, cervical and bowel screening. And obviously this is something that is a trans issue as well. And Alexa was able to come in, train our staff, who then were able to train community facilitators across all of Northern Ireland on this, to ensure that everyone who was providing these workshops knew if someone asked them, if someone asked them an issue and it was something that you wouldn't normally be asked or they never would have known about before, they were trained on where to signpost to and what terminology to use. And it's just an example of how, you know, beyond the everyday campaigning, you know, in every aspect of our work, we try and include to make sure it's trans inclusive across all of it. And for us, I think it's been a huge benefit, and we've gained a lot and are constantly learning from the movement and constantly being reminded about how to make our own movement more inclusive. And I think it's something we always work towards.
Absolutely. And I mean, those connections between kind of healthcare and the bodily autonomy side of things are really, really important, because we obviously always talk about this kind of idea of bodily autonomy whenever we're thinking about abortion and reproductive justice. And we have to kind of expand that and make sure that, you know, bodily autonomy doesn't just include abortion, reproductive justice doesn't just include abortion, because it's so much more than that. It's access to sexual health testing and screening and accurate and up-to-date sexual health information that doesn't just, like, you know, reinforce these patriarchal values of women and marginalized genders are, you know, are submissive or are you know, should be put down. And in reality, that is what our sexual health education and relationships and sex education regime, or lack thereof, in Northern Ireland currently does. It reinforces those values. But when we're thinking about kind of access to healthcare and bodily autonomy, it's about expanding that conversation out. Fertility, making sure that trans people have access to fertility treatment, making sure that lesbians, cis and trans, are also able to access, you know, IVF and other forms of fertility treatment where needed, where that currently isn't the case in Northern Ireland, at least not to a significant extent. Sorry, Robin, go on ahead.
Or in another example, so trans men, cis women, etc., can all access, you know, ways to ensure that they can't get pregnant.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You know, sexual health, access to contraception and things like that, and making sure that health workers are trained to not, you know, well, one, not slut shame anyone, two, to be trans inclusive and to be trans affirming, not you know, put their foot in it whenever they're dealing with a trans client, and that kind of access to healthcare, feeling comfortable accessing healthcare, is really, really important. And you know, that's kind of why a lot of the community sector things exist. That's why the Rainbow Project set up their sexual health testing and screening services. And it's why they give out, you know, contraception, and it's why we do the same in the Belfast Trans Resource Centre. You know, it's having access to this kind of healthcare is life-saving. It's not, you know, it is life-saving, and it's incredibly important that it is there for people.
Yeah, and I think it's just another example of how this is something that we would have campaigned on from the student movement perspective, from the human rights organization perspective, and through to the women's sector. And I think, from my experience anyway, is this is the area where it's easiest for me to work with Alexa, because our work is just so similar and it flows together naturally, because there is such an overlap. So when we're talking about bodily autonomy, we're talking about stigma, we're talking about the patriarchy, misogyny, you you know, these are issues that exist for all of us. And for me in my role, I wouldn't be working properly as a women's sector lobbyist if I wasn't constantly making myself aware of issues for trans women. And it's something that I'm very conscious of as well, is that there are times, I've discussed this with Alexa actually, there's times when as a movement we really struggle to get in the room with decision makers in the first place, but when we do, they often limit it to one woman from one women's organisations, and you represent all women in Northern Ireland and we don't need to hear from any more women. And that's something that's really difficult, because they'll come to me and say, right, you're a women's sector lobbyist, you're here. And I say, okay, well, we also should have Here and I, or Transgender and I, or Northern Ireland Rural Women's Network, or Northern Ireland Women's European Platform. You know, these are all women with different levels of expertise. Should we not be bringing them in too? And they look at it like, no, you've reached your quota. So that's why we're working together.
It's especially annoying when you consider that there's also disabled women, women of color, and so on and so on. So just having one representative for our population just doesn't make sense.
Absolutely.
It doesn't cut it, really, and that is the problem with a lot of these kind of quote unquote engagements from the government, from the civil service, is that it just is too little, too late, and it just falls completely short of the kind of community engagement that's needed to actually make good laws and to actually make good policy and to actually govern well, for everyone, not just for a small subset of people. And I did want to come back to the kind of the discussion around like the bodily autonomy, the access to abortion, and stuff like that. Just because, again, to bring it back to the kind of theoretical basis for cross working on that, you know, access to abortion is restricted specifically to, you know, control people's bodies. Access to trans healthcare is restricted specifically to control people's bodies. You know, it is a patriarchal state that is kind of essentially stating that anyone who is not a cisgender heterosexual white male is going to be controlled in some way or other by the state. And that's the reality of all of our situations, especially when it comes to having control over our bodies. And I mean, if any of you have went through, you know, trans healthcare services, I know some of you have, you know, it can be really, really difficult to actually have the autonomy and have the ability to express your actual experience. And to, you know, we often find that people go and tell the clinicians what they want to hear, because, you know, they have a specific idea of what a trans person is, and if you don't fit into that box, then you don't get treatment. And, you know, that's breaking out of that and making sure that all trans people, no matter what their background, whether they're you know, whether they're disabled or autistic or a person of color or a migrant or a refugee or any kind of trans person, is able to access reproductive healthcare, is able to access abortion, is able to access transition-related healthcare, and because it all comes back to the same thing. It's a patriarchal control of our bodies, and of our expressions and of our experience within society.
Elaine, do you want to come in there?
I was just going to say, related to what we were talking about a minute ago, about how difficult it is to get in the room and then one person's allowed in. Like, that's not an accident. It's not that they actually think that Rachel is representative of all women and all women's experiences. It's that they know they have to let somebody in, and that way they can cover their own back. And they're actually actively trying to exclude voices by including the bare minimum. And then even sometimes when you are in the room and you try to speak, you're basically told, in more or less in those words, you've spoken enough now. You've had your chance.
Yeah, you've been with me when that happened in a meeting.
Yes. Yeah.
By a certain politician told me to stop talking, you've talked enough, after men spoke for 40 minutes straight and no women spoke at all in the meeting. So it happens all the time. And I've been on panels before with Elaine, and they've looked at us and said, well, are you going to share your time? And we're like, why would we share our time just because there's two of us on the panel? Did you ask those two guys to share their time? No, you didn't. As soon as anyone wants to talk about liberation issues, they think one person, check, we're done. And that's why for me and Alexa anyway, we constantly are sending briefings back and forward to each other. So like today, for example, I I got an invite from the head of the civil service to sit on the executive has formed a COVID response team, and they want information from all different stakeholders in Northern Ireland on, just everything essentially. It was very hectic. It was this online system, and we had an hour, and there was like 100 questions, and you had to put in whatever evidence you could, and they're going to make it into a report that goes to the executive to inform how they're going to deal with the next stage of recovery. I knew already that no one from the LGBT movement was going to be in the room, so I had to go to everything that has been sent to me recently, copied and pasted it, put it in. I knew that there were no students in the room and had to just put in, students have been totally left behind in all of this, brought up around, dodgy renters, fees, why is education being treated as a private good, why is there no support, all these different things. And then was able to hammer home all of the other stuff that we've put in, because I knew that I was in a chat full of business people. And it was so obvious, because what we wanted and what we thought should be the priority for government was very, very different. So that's just, again, another example. I know we had a few other things we were going to mention about just even, rallies and campaigning and marches, and how we find working on these together to be incredibly positive experiences, and something, that we're constantly learning. Like, as a women's movement, we learn from the trans movement constantly on, what more can we be doing to be inclusive. And I think you'd probably agree, more and more trans people are becoming involved in, like International Women's Day rallies, or rallies for choice, and all of these different things in recent years. And I think we're quite far apart from the south of Ireland on this, and we're quite far apart from GB on this, because I don't know, I think there's been activists spending years making sure that we're not getting pulled into that fractured stuff and turfy nonsense, really, is what I tend to call it, and just block everyone that tries to engage with me on it online. But yeah, that's kind of all that I really had to cover, unless there's anything else you want to bring up, Alexa.
100%. I mean, yeah, like, just in terms of all of the kind of the rallies and stuff like that, I mean, we've learned a lot from the women's sector in terms of applying grassroots public pressure. We were planning on using the Trans Pride this year as a kind of big push for trans healthcare, and unfortunately we were not able to do that, which is why we're kind of turning around and saying, okay, how do we do this? So we've got another event tomorrow to basically say, okay, how do we organise from the grassroots in a time of COVID for better transition related healthcare? And so absolutely, we've learned a lot from the women's sector on that. And I mean, just in terms of like kind of cross working, it doesn't stop in the kind of the feminist issues or in the trans issues. We work in healthcare, we work in education, we work in housing, we work in access to welfare, we work to fight the onset of austerity, and in so many different areas. Where we work together to try to build that kind of united and joint response to issues and to areas where people are being marginalized and people are being oppressed. And really the kind of question that we have to open it up a little bit more is how we can continue to do that and how we can do that better. And if there's anything that you would like to see us working together on, if there's anything that you think that we've left out of our activism or anything like that, we want to hear your thoughts on this. And as I said at the start, if you want to speak now, you're absolutely welcome to. If you don't want that to appear in the video after, give me a message and I'll cut it out.
Hi there. I have a few things to say. As soon as I can remember them.
Take your time.
Just executive dysfunction things. TM.
It's a mood. But yeah, just in terms of... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Basically, although I'm still rather new to actually getting active in activism, pun unintended, I definitely see that a lot of you do care very deeply for intersectionality, which is really heckin' great, especially since I am someone with quite noticeable learning difficulties and neurodivergence, so it's definitely helped me in particular to feel more comfortable. And I definitely think that, especially with this global pandemic, that housing issues are definitely going to start becoming more and more apparent as time goes on, because you thought they were bad before, they're gonna get a whole lot worse now.
Absolutely. And you know, like, housing is one of the kind of the biggest quiet things that we fight on. You know, there's the big fights on, you know, access to trans healthcare and access to, you know, gender recognition and legislation reform. But housing is one of those basic rights that is just not guaranteed by our state. And you know, it's not guaranteed in Northern Ireland. And there's lots of different ways that we can fight that. It's a massive undertaking, you know, kind of getting housing for everyone. But
it's a very difficult task that definitely needs that intersectionality if we're going to have any chance in hell of securing housing for all.
absolutely, 100%. And you know, like, one of the directions that we could take, and it's something that I've thought a little bit about, is I mean, you know, there's this big push, and there always has been this big push for the Bill of Rights, introducing a Bill of Rights into Northern Irish law, because we don't currently have fit for purpose equality legislation that actually protects people's rights. We have, like, Section 75, and we have the sex discrimination legislation, and you know, we have all of these different, like, little tidbits that are dotted around our legislative framework, and it creates a kind of work.
And even a lot of those are severely outdated or not fit for...
Absolutely not fit for purpose at all. And you know, one of the kind of ways that I think we should tackle that possibly is, you know, including the right to housing in a Bill of Rights. Like, what difference would that make to Northern Ireland society, and kind of, you know, thinking about
a massive difference.
Absolutely, thinking about what kind of rights we want included and considered in things like that. Rachel, do you have anything to say on that?
Just on a Bill of Rights, so that's something that we both sit on the Bill of Rights working group, and we're looking at the pandemic and how everyone's lives have changed so drastically, and we're getting agreement from most people. You know, we won't go back to the way things were before. It's not possible, but we're trying to use this as an opportunity to really highlight, you know, low paid, precarious work, gender segregated labour, issues around housing and welfare. And even though you can say that these issues exist for almost everyone in Northern Ireland, when you look at cis women and trans communities, and you look at the most marginalised groups, they're always worse off. And it's kind of a tactic that we've been using, is highlighting where discrimination exists. And then when you break that down intersectionally, this is how much worse it is. And we've been trying to apply intersectionality to that work. And one thing that's been quite positive recently is seeing in Northern Ireland, they're now reacting to COVID a bit differently from GB, which, you know, I'm from a border town, I'm very thankful for that. And maybe there's potential for that to continue on in the response. And does that fit into a Bill of Rights? And, you know, will we cover our working rights and anti-discrimination legislation that we're losing from the EU Charter? Because the European Convention is no longer strong without the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So we need to find creative ways to show the rights that are at risk and ensure that those who have been discriminated against have greater protections. And even just, Robin, on your point in disability, like, I'm a disabled woman, and it's one of those things where I'm sitting in a room sometimes and I'm like, right, am I talking about sexuality, gender, class, disability, like, what hat have I got on? And it can be difficult, because when you try and cover a wide range of issues that impact you, quite often they're like, no, we heard enough about gender now, let's move on. And you're like, well, actually, you know, experiences are a bit more nuanced than that, and this is why you need more than one person in the room talking about intersectionality.
Absolutely. And just to come back to the, you mentioned a little bit about kind of employment rights and folks in work, and that was something that Leon brought up in the chat there a few minutes ago. And it's so relevant right now. I mean, I'll be honest, I just got off the phone with a friend before this Zoom chat talking about how her employer is currently screwing her over. And I mean, the reality of the situation is that, one, so few people in Northern Ireland are unionised, especially when you look at retail workers, especially when you look at, kind of those that are considered essential workers. And those that are considered essential workers are almost always, there's a whole lot of women in there. There's a lot of trans people in there as well, working those frontline jobs. And it's about making sure that employment rights are also ensured, but also that our labour is continuously being exploited and being essentially ripped off because of the kind of society that we live in. And it's about fighting that and kind of saying after all this COVID stuff, that we can't go back to normal with this.
Yeah. I think it's exposed how like the patriarchy is connected to how different types of work is valued. So caring work and cleaning work and nursing, health and social care, all of these professions were seen as feminine, so they were underpaid and undervalued, and we need to challenge that, because it's always coming back to these gender binaries as well and how it influences policy. And for me, I was on a call that Yona had organised with NIWEP just before now. And parenting, yes, exactly, Elaine. Even now, looking at homeschooling and the whole mess it's creating. But the call that was just before this with NIWEP mentioned there's going to be a lot of gender pay discussions in the recovery and how we tackle gender pay gaps. And I think from this, we need to question how different professions are valued and how what they consider low skilled work, how that's been exposed to be untrue, and really keeping the momentum going.
As someone who used to be a retailer and whose parents are both in the high risk, actually saying that all of my family are in one or two of the high risk groups, yay. And my dad in particular, being a security guard for a hospital, he can work during this pandemic because he would very much like to not die, thank you very much. So that kind of intersectionality is of particular interest to me because it's very close to home.
That's completely reasonable, and I mean, I mean, from my own perspective, and I've considered myself a feminist for a long time, but I would specifically consider myself a Marxist feminist. And whenever we're thinking about these quote unquote low paid, low skilled, all this malarkey jobs and roles, again, we have to think about who's in them. It's working class people, it's working class women, it's working class trans folks, it's working class LGBT people, migrants, and racialized people who are often put at the most risk, number one, and are given the least protection, and it's something that does need to change. And again, it's something that won't change without all of these different groups, all of these different movements kind of joining together and having a set of demands and basically saying, this is what we want. We can't go back to what happened before because all of these different people suffered under that kind of model of society. And this is what we want going forward. And hopefully that's something that we've been doing.
There was a name for this particular movement of sorts for equality.
I will definitely keep working on it anyway. I want to check, because I know we're near the end of this, if anyone else has any questions or comments that they want to give us at all, or anything on work we are doing or want us to go forward. Danielle?
Yeah, I feel like we're hopefully getting into a maintenance stage of the feminist and trans movements working together, because there has been years of groundwork done, and I think now it's far more likely that an organisation is going to be trans inclusive than isn't. If we're looking at grassroots feminist organising and women's centres, and people are still learning and might have stumbles with language and things like that, but I am hopeful that we have now built up enough that we aren't going to be susceptible to the things we're seeing in England and further afield. Elaine and I organised the Reclaim the Night March, which is normally in November, so who knows, probably not this year. Who knows? We normally have to start organising it around this time of year because they take so long to give us approval because we're controversial. But from the start, we have had a trans organisation speak as well as a sex worker organisation, because it's that sort of, when you've got a space, expanding it to try and pull other people in with you. So like Rachel was saying about meetings, like if one of us gets a meeting, then they will have a consultation kind of with other groups being like, is there anything in particular you want me to bring up? Because we know not everybody's going to get through the door. So until we get everybody through the door, then we need to keep going with the kind of highlighting, shining the light on the other issues that might not be considered by policymakers and those in power.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, like, I think there's been enough, goodwill shown between the kind of different movements in terms of like showing up for each other and fighting for each other, and so many trans folks fighting for access to abortion, and so many feminists fighting against transphobia in the press and within feminist movements. That kind of goodwill doesn't go unnoticed. It absolutely kind of contributes to people's ability and their kind of comfort levels engaging with these different movements. And so, I'm really glad that the groundwork was done, and that hopefully we can kind of maintain that and keep going. And I mean, we also acknowledge that there's still work to be done for other folks as well. And I'm, constantly working to be, inclusive of disabled people in my work, inclusive of, racialized folks as well, in particular, because the LGBT sector and the women's sector is overwhelmingly white.
Very white. It's something we struggle with, and it's something we know we need to improve. And we're constantly trying to be more inclusive of all groups, but again, sorry Alexa, I kind of cut you off there. Just want to say quickly to Danielle, like myself and Alexa wouldn't be able to do the work that we're doing now without the groundwork that you and others have done before we managed to get into the movement. And there's been work from activists who've been involved in the trans movements and feminist movements in Northern Ireland over the last number of decades that made it possible for us to now fully make sure that we're working with each other all the time, and we're really working following on from that, and we wouldn't be able to do this without that work in the past. So it's just a thank you to everyone that has come before us to do that and made it possible, even to have this chat today. we were talking about who might join this chat, and we're thinking if you tried to do this and you were an English organisation, you'd be quite afraid of who was on it compared to us doing it. And that's just a testament to how strong the movements have worked together in recent years.
And that is something that the TERF groups are starting to do now, is send people into things. Like they've sent people into Stonewall's focus groups for trans people, gathering information to report back and put it all on social media and things, while misgendering the participants that were there. That's the kind of thing that they're doing now.
Absolutely, and that's
which is ironic considering the main argument is about trans people invading their spaces.
That's why we try to kind of
the lack of self-awareness is mind-blowing.
And all of our kind of like a week of events, obviously, we can't put the Zoom link out there just because, for safety reasons, we want to protect people and we want to protect these spaces, and we want to make sure that everyone feels like they can engage in these events and in these discussions safely. So that's kind of the kind of background to why, you had to email or DM one of us to get an invite or a link to this. But we are so glad that you could join us for it. We are so glad that this discussion can happen in Northern Ireland, and that this kind of work can actually go on and can keep going, hopefully, past COVID, through all of this, and kind of continue avoiding the mistakes that have been made in other areas of the world, especially in Britain, with the kind of fractures between our communities. I don't think those fractures are going to happen. I think that if we keep working as we have, and if the communities continue to be engaged and involved, and engaged, involved, but also kind of ingrained in each other, and almost inseparable. Tripping over my words, but I think that we can really, really make a lot of gains, and hopefully it starts with hate crime, and moves on to go on to other big things as well.
Hate crime, abortion, care work. We hopefully by the end of the year, all the work we've been doing might have some good results.
Hell yeah, and thank you so much for Leon for the wonderful comment in the chat there. I'm glad you found it useful. Are there any other questions before we shut this off?
No.
Any other comments? No? Well, wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining. We really, really appreciate it. We hope you find it interesting and useful. And I mean, we're running an event, a healthcare event tomorrow, from 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock for trans people and allies to basically discuss the current situation with trans healthcare and look forward and see kind of where we can go in terms of campaigning on this during the coronavirus and beyond. And yeah, there's lots of other events that are being run by our wonderful colleagues in the LGBT sector. We posted a link to the entire schedule, so please do check it out. And yeah, we hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you as well to everyone for coming along, and thank you to Alexa for inviting me to do this session with you. And just for everyone, I hope you have a brilliant LGBT Awareness Week, and that this was useful. Gives you a bit of an insight to what we're doing in the background when we're running in between meetings, and also maybe give you some ideas on how you can get involved as well. And even if you have anything that comes up related to any of these areas that we're working on, never be afraid to just send us a message. Are you going to be lobbying on this? Have you any meetings coming up on that? Are you going to be meeting with ministers? Can you, they really like when we give them personal stories of what is happening, because it tends to make things happen quicker. So just don't be afraid to reach out to us moving forward, and constantly let us know what we can be doing to improve things. And hopefully we can all be stronger together in this recovery period, whenever it starts. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you all so much. Solidarity, and I will see you all very soon.